everyone, we're going to graph y equals sine squared x plus cosine squared x over the domain of, we're going to use negative pi over 2 to pi over 2 inclusive. So that's your domain. And I'm going to assume, I know I'm not supposed to assume, but I'm going to assume that before you do this video that you've had some trigonometry. We know that sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. And that's from your Pythagorean trig identities, because this is like saying y squared plus x squared, and we know that's equals 1. That's one of your identities, but we're going to graph it. So let's look at some of this and do a table. So this is where I'm going to kind of assume that you know some of the radian values. So I'm going to plug in my x into this equation and get my y value. So if I do sine squared of x, so basically I'm doing sine of pi over 2, negative pi over 2, and we're doing cosine of negative pi over 2. Well, sine of negative pi over 2, and then we're going to use this formula. So sine of negative pi over 2 is negative 1, so we're going to square that. Cosine of negative pi over 2 is 0, square that, and that gives you 1. So that gives you 1. Now, I'm going to do pi over 2 since I already have it written down. So that's going to be positive, positive. Well, sine of pi over 2 is positive 1, and cosine of pi over 2 is 0, so that still gives you 1. Now let's try negative pi over 3. So sine of negative pi over 3, and then we're going to do cosine of negative pi over 3, and then when you get that, you just square it. So sine of negative pi over 3 is negative square root of 3 over 2, and cosine of negative pi over 3 is 1/2. And when you square all that out, you get 1. So this is 1. And when you put the pluses in here, this part's going to turn to positive. And so you get 1 here. So you can see where we're going with this. Now let's try negative pi over 6. So sine negative pi over 6, and then you're going to square it, plus cosine negative pi over 6, and you square it. So sine of negative pi over 6 is negative 1/2. You square it, plus cosine of negative pi over 6 is square root of 3 divided by 2, and that equals 1 because it's the same as that, so that's 1. And then again, if you make these both positive, this would have been negative again. So you get the same thing, so that's 1. And now let's try 0. So if we use sine of 0, square it, plus cosine of 0, and then you square it, you're going to get 0 squared plus 1 squared, which equals 1. So all of this equals 1. Therefore, the graph looks like that. This is a good graph to remember because it's on a lot of tests. So, but that's why. So all these values in between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2 inclusive equals 1. And that's it. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Weezy,